Behind me is the Place de la Concorde in present-day Paris, France. Um, it's important for us to look at, although it may seem surprising initially, because during the French Revolution, this was called the Place de la Révolution, and it is where a number of executions took place by guillotine, including the execution of the French king Louis XVI and his wife, Queen Marie Antoinette. And believe it or not, the French Revolution had a lot to do with American history during its early years, and so it's important to know something about the French Revolution in order to understand the American response to it and the way in which the French Revolution and the wars that it generated between revolutionary France and Great Britain, the way in which these influenced the United States. So I'm going to share the screen with you. Here we go. I'm going to back it up one slide. Okay. You probably remember this. I hope you remember this slide from the presentation on the War for American Independence. You'll recall that it was a French fleet that blocked the British from getting into the Chesapeake Bay and rescuing Cornwallis's British Army at Yorktown, Virginia, and set the stage for the Franco-American victory um, over Cornwallis at Yorktown that caused the British government to abandon the contest, to regain the colonies. Now, the reason I mention this here is that it cost France a lot of money to support the Americans. And of course, they ended up fighting a war that took place elsewhere in the Caribbean and so forth. They ended up fighting on the side of Spain and of the Dutch Republic against Great Britain. But all of this cost a great deal of money. And the French, the ability of the Kingdom of France to sort of extract taxes from from within its own country and so forth was cumbersome. And so by 1789, um, the French government, or the government of France, was just about out of money, and it had to summon um, three groups. They were called the nobility, the clergy, and commoners together in something called the Estates General to take another look at the finances of France, how these things were generated in order to get enough money for the Kingdom of France to do its business. And a lot of the impetus for this was because of French participation in the War for American Independence. So there's King Louis the XVI, and he reigned from 1774. So he started his reign just before the War for American Independence broke out. Of course, his reign came to an end in 1792. His life came to an end, not long after that. And then, of course, on the right we have a map of France as it appeared, on the eve of the French Revolution. Now, the prelude to the French Revolution occurred when these three estates, the nobility, the clergy, and ordinary people, by which we really are talking about the wealthier middle class. These three estates got together. Each estate had one vote. The clergy, these weren't clergy in the modern sense, of clergy. These were powerful men who controlled a lot of property, a lot of wealth, and for all practical purposes, were like the nobility. And so it was clear to the commoners, what's called the Third Estate, that they were going to get outvoted 2-1, and they weren't going to stand for it. And so they went off by themselves. They took an oath that they were not going to disband until France had a constitutional monarchy and ordinary people were represented. Um, and and not too long, after all this, you saw this group, write and publish the Declaration on the Rights of Man and the Citizen, and this bears a kind of a family resemblance to the Declaration of Independence, but they weren't drawing directly on the Declaration of Independence. They were drawing on this ferment of ideas about uh, constitutional monarchy or republics, the same political philosophical discussions that mostly American elites had been paying attention to, for in previous decades. So the ideas influenced France, but it wasn't like the American Revolution directly influenced France, but the same ferment of ideas is there. Uh, the date of sort of French Independence Day, as it were, is dated from July 14th, 1789, when really ordinary people took matters into their own hands and they stormed this castle, which was being used as a prison uh, in Paris. And this storming of the Bastille is known as Bastille Day in France. Again, it's the equivalent of French Independence Day, very the most important such date in France, and so that takes place. Then you have the Legislative Assembly that comes into being in 1791 through 1792, and you notice that you have three groups: the constitutional monarchists, moderates, and the Jacobins. And this is significant because the constitutional monarchists were really committed to the idea of retaining the king, retaining the monarchy, but sort of reorganizing it so that it was like the constitutional monarchy that prevailed in Great Britain, where Parliament had a great deal of power and the king had only some power. And if Louis XVI had gone along with this, it would not have been a problem, but he didn't. He tried to escape, tried to flee the country. He was captured. He was brought back, and when it became clear that he was not going to play ball, that's when a republic was established. And then not long after that, Louis XVI was, guillotined, because you really couldn't have someone pretending to be, the king of France when it was now a republic. You couldn't take a chance on him leaving the country again. You couldn't take a chance on people, rallying to him. You really needed to show that there was no going back. Now, the reason why I'm showing you this diagram, though, is notice that in this legislative assembly, the delegates were seated according to their political opinion about what was going on. And so the constitutional monarchists sat together, and they sat together on the right side of the chamber in which the legislative assembly met. And then Jacobins, who are the most radical and the ones who really were pressing for a republic the most, they sat on the left side of the Legislative Assembly. And the reason why this matters is that today we talk about, the right wing and left wing, and this is where this comes from. And you notice that the conceptual metaphor that we're using here is that of a spectrum that goes from, the far right to the far left. And those are the terms in which we think about it. And so we try to place every political party, every political movement, or whatever, somewhere on this linear spectrum between right and left. But a great many political movements do not fit easily into this spectrum, and you can put them on the far right, you can put them on the far left, and some people have said that you can take the spectrum idea and it goes all the way around. You can sort of bend it all the way around 360 so that the far left and the far right are sort of indistinguishable. Well, that's all because we're stuck with this conceptual metaphor of a political spectrum. If we get away from that, we would really, I think, in some respects, be better off. It would help our understanding of the political scene. But the idea of right and left didn't come from nowhere. It came from this legislative assembly in France. As I say, King Louis XVI was executed in early 1793. This is right after the French Republic had been proclaimed. And this begins to intersect with the American perspective. Americans initially reacted to news of the French Revolution with elation. They understood the French Revolution as being, um, as being like the American Revolution. But as the Revolution began to play out, the Americans became more disquieted. Okay. As time went on, the, um, the Jeffersonians and the Hamiltonians, the Federalists, began to look at the French Revolution in different ways. The Jeffersonians were much more comfortable with the revolution as it unfolded, and it made more changes to French society, and began to sort of to threaten and then ultimately to change the form of government that France had. Um, Jefferson tended to be okay with this. Alexander Hamilton and his adherents, the Federalist Party, were much more concerned. And over in Great Britain, there was a British member of Parliament, a guy named Edmund Burke, who looked over at what was going on in the French Revolution. And actually, a year after it started, 1790, he published a book called Reflections on the Revolution in France, that in terms of conservatism, as we understand it today, Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France is an important founding document, because what Burke said and what the Hamiltonians believed implicitly. I'd be curious to know how many of them actually read Reflections on the Revolution in France at some point. But what Burke argued is that you can't just change society any way that you want it to be. That society is woven from a kind of a fabric, and that institutions that have been in place for a long time and ways of doing things that have been in place for a long time, you can't just change them. Otherwise, in terms of taking the fabric of society and redoing it the way that you want to, you're going to create problems that you didn't expect would be created. Conservatives believe in the law of unintended consequences, is the way that I put it. It's not an exclusively conservative idea, but I think it's a hallmark of conservatism in the real sense, in the true sense of it, the Burkean sense of it. They believe in the law of unintended consequences. Well, the Federalist Party believed in the law of unintended consequences, and they believed that they were concerned that the Jeffersonians didn't have a problem with it. They felt like, boy, if the Jeffersonians are on board with the French Revolution as it seems to be, turning violent and destructive of people's lives and remaking society willy nilly, so forth. If they're comfortable with that over in France, maybe they're going to get comfortable with it, or maybe they're already comfortable with it, with making those kinds of changes here in this country. And the Jeffersonians, looking at the Federalist Party, the Hamiltonian perspective, they thought that in effect the Federalists were on the side of monarchy. They didn't like the idea of the French monarchy being threatened and ultimately going away. And Alexander Hamilton had been, for all practical purposes, a monarchist, and since he wanted to see a president elected for life. And so uh, each side looked at each other with a great deal of suspicion. The Hamiltonians looked at the Jeffersonians and said, these people want to create a situation that's going to devolve into anarchy, and so our republic is going to go away. And the one way that republics can go away, which is to say, they just fall apart completely. And then the Jeffersonians, looking at the Federalists, felt like, well, they want the republic to fall apart in the other way, which is to say, you see the emergence of another king or of an authoritarian government. These are the two ways that when republics die, that's how they die. And this had major effects domestically. And we'll look at that in a moment. But in the meantime, um, the United States had to deal with what was going on in from a practical standpoint, from a foreign policy standpoint. And one problem didn't have anything to do with the French Revolution, per se, but by this time the British were starting out on the verge of war with France, and then by the mid 1790s were at war with France, and there were problems. There were problems with British forts remaining on American soil. And there was a problem with with British warships stopping merchant vessels on the high seas and removing from them by force able-bodied seamen, sailors, because you really couldn't get people to enlist in the British Navy, the Royal Navy, voluntarily. It sucked. Life sucked, on a warship. It sucked on a merchant vessel too, but at least you're getting paid decently, and you could leave if you didn't like it. Neither of these things were true if you were if you had to serve in the Royal Navy. So the Royal Navy, if it needed power, more manpower on a given vessel, they would stop a merchant vessel, they would go aboard, and they would look for English subjects. And they weren't particular about who they got. Sometimes they actually got Englishmen. Sometimes they got Americans. They would say, "Well, I'm not an English subject. I'm an American citizen." And they were like, "Well, like prove it." Well, they wouldn't have a passport or any kind of documentation, and so they would be taken. They would be impressed. So you had American citizens being taken from merchant vessels, taken away, and then forced to serve in the British Navy. So this was something else that Americans had to be concerned about. The Washington administration had to be concerned about. And so John Jay and two others were sent over to England to negotiate a treaty. And it wasn't a great treaty. The British said, "Yeah, we'll remove those forts." And by the way, they really didn't. Uh, and yeah, we'll stop impressing sailors on the high seas. Well, they didn't do that either. In exchange, though, we want to have what amounts to most favored nation trade status. In other words, what this did was it put the United States in the position of tacitly or implicitly supporting Great Britain in its war with France. But this was a really it was the best deal that Jay and his two negotiating partners could get, but it sucked. And when word of the treaty came back, the Senate ratified it and so on. But when people found out about it, they burned John Jay in effigy all over the country. John Jay, said, that I could walk from one end of the country to the other at night by the light of burning effigies of me. Well, 2 years later, Washington had finished his term, and he left office in 1797, of course, when the second president, John Adams, came in, and he gave a farewell address. And the farewell address, dealt with a number of things, but the most famous part of it was he warned against the danger of what he called foreign entanglements. Well, the United States was already entangled in the wars of the Revolution. They were entangled with Great Britain. They were entangled with France, or they were entangled with these European powers. And basically, Washington said, in effect, don't get into this situation any more than you have to, and get out of it as soon as you can, and just leave the Europeans to deal with European problems, on their own. Don't take sides in something like the French Revolution. Don't take sides in something in the future. This is going to be like a real problem. Well, Washington died not long after that, and you can see. I think this is in the rotunda of the Capitol. I'm not sure, but you can see what it is. It is in fact a painting of Washington kind of being taken up to heaven when he dies, and it was like they call the apotheosis of George Washington. And really, there has never been such a man in American history, taken all in all. The indispensable man in terms of winning American independence, the indispensable man in terms of walking the 55 delegates through the Constitutional Convention, the indispensable man in being a man of such integrity that if entrusted with the presidency, you knew that he was not going to become a dictator. And the indispensable man in terms of establishing the precedents of the the U.S. government and the presidency when it first began under the constitutional reign. There has never been anybody like him in the American experience. Even other great presidents, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, and so on, were polarizing figures in their own lifetimes. Washington was really not that. By and large, everybody respected Washington, and his passing from the scene, political scene, and then like the scene of like human life, was a source of real misgivings and sadness and so on, because American citizens knew that they had lost somebody of the sort that they were never going to see again. Okay. As the Adams administration, began, it began in the throes of a full-scale antagonism between the Federalist Party and what was now being called the Republican Party, the Democratic Republican Party, Jeffersonians, whatever you want to call it. And Adams himself was a Federalist, but there were sort of different flavors of federalism, and Adams was not as much of a Federalist, as it were, as Alexander Hamilton was, and Adams became a little suspicious of Hamilton as time went on. All during this period, there was, to varying degrees, a war scare with France, a rather sort of fanciful idea that a French army might come over and invade. There was also, and this was not fanciful at all, there was an undeclared naval war between the United States and France being carried on in the Atlantic Ocean and the Caribbean Sea, because French vessels, were stopping American vessels and capturing them and so forth. And then there were American vessels, both warships and what were called privateers, which was like legalized pirates, who were fighting the French in this undeclared war. So, the the treaty between the United States and the French king, Louis XIV, the Kingdom of France, that was gone. And the United States and revolutionary France were antagonists. And the fact that the Jeffersonians were kind of cool with, the revolutionary people, and the fact that revolutionary agents from the French Revolution, could come to the United States and kind of stir up trouble, and the Jeffersonians didn't seem to have a real problem with this, created more and more animosity and more fear between the Federalists and the Jeffersonians. And of course, the Federalists were in power. They held the presidency, they had a majority in Congress. And so in 1798, they passed what were called the Alien and Sedition Acts. And these consisted in four parts. I'm going to walk you through each one. The first one was called the Naturalization Act of 1798, and it increased the period required for immigrants to become citizens from 5 to 14 years. So, if you happen to come from France, or if you came from some European country, whatever, not only were you going to have to live in the United States for 5 years, but you're going to have to live, in the United States for 14 years before you could become a citizen, before you could vote, before you could hold public office, or anything like that. That was a reaction to the war scare with France. So was the Alien so-called Friends Act of 1798, which allowed the president to imprison and deport foreigners. Now, the first one was repealed in 1802. The second one expired in 1800. But the third one, the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, actually still survives in federal law. And what it did was it gave the president more powers to detain foreigners during times of war, invasion, or predatory incursion. That's essentially the language. This Alien Enemies Act has been used 3 times in American history for sure: the War of 1812 and the First and Second World Wars. Earlier this year, the administration of President Trump invoked it in its modern form, in terms of declaring a Venezuelan sort of criminal organization, sort of designating them as terrorists, and then tying this group as terrorists, now not criminals, as terrorists, to the Venezuelan government. And by the way, American intelligence services basically said this linkage doesn't exist. But as far as the administration of President Trump is concerned, it does in fact exist. And what I want you to think about, rather than thinking whether the Trump administration is right or wrong, notice that this is an act of Congress, but it gave the president really the power to determine when this Alien Enemies Act or whatever was going to come into force. What happened, the sort of history of the United States has been kind of a history of gradually giving the president of the United States sort of, increasing amounts of power, which they might use in wartime and then would go away, or in the 20th century, powers that the president gained and retained, particularly in the post 1945 era, the nuclear era, when when somebody was going to need to make a decision if there were Soviet missiles coming at us, ICM missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles coming at the United States. You didn't have time to convene Congress. The president of the United States was the only person who could make the decision about nuclear retaliation. And so, President Trump, like every president since 1945 or thereabouts, has that power. He has an officer who follows him around continuously with a briefcase called the football. It has the codes for doing a nuclear strike. Every president of the United States, has that. Again, it's a function of these expanded powers for the presidency that over time seem to be necessary. The Alien Enemies Act of 1798 is a real example of this. And then finally, you have the Sedition Act of 1798. And this criminalized, and I'm quoting here, criminalized false, scandalous, and malicious writing or writings against the government of the United States, or either house of the Congress of the United States, or the president of the United States. And actually, this wasn't something unprecedented. There was a sense that, that in order for government to be respected, there were certain kinds of language, certain kinds of criticism that could not be leveled. You couldn't just sort of slander the government and government officials. England had something like this. Now the United States had something like this, and people didn't like it. This was probably the act that there was the most angst about and the most disapproval about. Thomas Jefferson spoke out very strongly against it. James Madison spoke out very strongly against it. Virginia, in particular, and then Kentucky also, came up with written documents that spoke out against it as well. Well, it expired in 1800, but this gives you an idea of the degree of animosity between the Federalist Party, and the Jeffersonians, that these four federal acts would be put in place that were essentially intended to as a break on the Jeffersonians. And yeah, and this is American History Survey, so I could go into this deeper, but I'm going to stop. Well, in 1800, John Adams ran for a second term, and then Thomas Jefferson ran to be president. And so it was a contest really between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And it was going to play out, of course, in the Electoral College. And things went awry. And the next two film clips really talk about the way in which it goes awry. The first one deals with the election of 1800 itself and how problematic it was. And then the other clip, which is taken from the musical Hamilton, just sort of dramatizes, Alexander Hamilton's role in helping to resolve this disputed election of 1800. So I'll stop here and I'll ask you to watch those two clips, and they'll bring you up to speed on everything else you need to know about the early period of the United States. The one thing, though, that I want to underscore is that there was, at the end of the day, a peaceful transfer of power from the Federalist Party, who really didn't like the Jeffersonians at all, to the Jeffersonians, who really didn't like the Federalists. And this is a crucial first test for any republic. A lot of republics fall apart when it comes to a transfer of power from one party to another party that disagrees with it extensively. Many republics don't survive that first crucial test of a republic. The United States did.